She called the cops to drive me out of my cabin. What she didn't know was that I owned every tree, trail, and road in her precious valley. When I bought the old cabin tucked deep into the pines, I thought I had finally found peace. The world outside was loud, greedy, and fast. But here in the valley, time slowed. The wind whispered through tall evergreens, and deer wandered freely near the porch. The cabin wasn't new, but its wooden beams held stories older than me. I didn't expect trouble. Not here. Yet the first sign of it came within days. A neatly folded paper, stuffed into the crack of my door, printed in bold. Violation, unauthorized structure, paint color. I frowned. My cabin hadn't been painted in decades. Its dark brown logs blended with the forest. Who could possibly care? The signature at the bottom read, Karen Whitmore, HOA president. The next morning, I found her on my porch with a clipboard and a tape measure. She didn't even knock. "You can't just build or live here without approval," she said, eyes narrowed. I raised an eyebrow. This cabin's been standing for over 50 years. Karen clicked her pen like a weapon. "Not to our standards. The chimney's too high. The wood color isn't HOA approved. And your porch railing? Unsafe." I laughed. "Unsafe? It's held stronger than your clipboard." Her face turned red. "You'll regret that attitude. I'll be back with paperwork." 2 days later, just as the mountain morning fog was lifting, I heard the crunch of gravel outside. It wasn't the steady hum of a neighbor's truck or the rattle of an ATV. It was heavier, slower, deliberate. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw the black and white sheriff's cruiser easing up my drive, sunlight flashing off the windshield. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Dalton climbed out. He was a tall man with a weathered face, his Stetson pulled low against the glare. He adjusted his belt, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he walked toward me. And right behind him, arms crossed and lips curled in triumph, was Karen. She stood with the posture of a queen expecting victory, her pearl-white sweater far too clean for a gravel road. "Morning," the sheriff said, voice flat, unreadable. He tugged the brim of his hat. "Got a call. Something about an illegal squatter living in a prohibited structure." My jaw tightened. I could practically feel Karen's smugness radiating from where she stood. "This is my cabin," I said evenly, though heat pricked my neck. "Built on my own land. Been here for years. You want proof?" Karen let out a scoff, stepping forward like she was about to hand down judgment. "Sheriff, this man has no right to be here. The HOA has strict codes, and this shack," she waved her hand at my cabin like it was trash rotting in the sun, "isn't listed anywhere in the neighborhood records. He's clearly trespassing." Her voice dripped with satisfaction. She thought this was already decided. I didn't give her the chance to keep spinning lies. Without a word, I turned, went inside, and pulled the heavy folder from my desk drawer. Deeds, tax receipts, building permits from the county, all of it neatly arranged. The smell of old paper and ink calmed me as I carried it back outside. I placed the folder firmly in the sheriff's hands. He flipped through slowly, his thumb brushing over each official seal. Every nod of his head was another crack in Karen's smile. Her smirk began to tremble, her arms falling from that self-assured pose. "Looks in order to me," Sheriff Dalton finally said, snapping the folder shut. His voice carried the weight of finality. He turned to Karen, squinting. "Ma'am, stop wasting my time." Karen blinked, her face flushing red. But the HOA. The HOA doesn't outrank county deeds," the sheriff cut in sharply. His boots crunched as he stepped back toward his cruiser. "This man owns the land, the cabin's legal, and you've got no cause to drag me out here again for nonsense." He tipped his hat toward me. "You have a good day, sir." I gave him a small nod. "Appreciate it, Sheriff." Karen stood frozen, her nails digging in her palms, eyes burning holes through me. Her smirk was gone, replaced with something uglier, resentment. A deep, festering fury that told me this wasn't over. The cruiser rumbled back down the road, gravel, dust rising behind it. For a moment, the silence of the valley returned. Karen lingered, staring, her jaw clenched so tight I could hear her grinding teeth. "You think you've won," she hissed, finally turning on her heel. "But you'll regret ever defying me." I watch her storm off, my hands curled into fists. The sheriff might have closed the case, but in Karen's mind, the war had just begun. Curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. If Karen was going to drag my name through the mud, I wanted to hear it firsthand. The meeting was held in a rented community hall just off the highway, a squat concrete building with peeling paint and a sagging flag out front. The parking lot was already full when I arrived. SUVs and polished sedans gleamed under the harsh floodlights, their chrome flashing like polished armor. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and stale carpet. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as neighbors shuffled in, taking their places. At the far end of the room, a long table was set up like a tribunal bench, with Karen seated squarely in the middle. She stood the moment I entered, her lips curled into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Ah," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Our outsider has finally decided to grace us with his presence." A low murmur rippled through the room, followed by a few chuckles. Some people stared openly at me. Others avoided my gaze, as if siding with me might cost them something. Karen stepped to the podium like a queen guarding her throne, the little gavel in her hand tapping against the wood. She surveyed the room with the smugness of someone who thought she already won. "We have a problem in our community," she announced, projecting her voice. "A man who refuses to follow our rules. He occupies a cabin not authorized by this board, refuses to maintain appearances, and now thinks he can defy our authority." Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and dismissive. Karen held up a sheet of paper and waved it like a banner. "The violations have been tallied. As of today, this squatter owes thousands in fines." The paper was passed from hand to hand, neighbors glancing at it before snickering and shaking their heads. When it reached me, I snatched it from the air and scanned it. My name was scrawled at the top, followed by a long list of absurd charges: unauthorized structure, improper fencing, environmental disruption, noise disturbance, excessive woodpile, visual blight. Each fine climbed higher than the last, stacked like bricks meant to crush me. My pulse hammered in my ears. "This is a joke," I said, holding up the paper. "You don't have the authority to levy these fines. This cabin is legally mine, and no HOA decree overrides county law." But before I could continue, a wall of noise drowned me out. Jeers, boos, mocking laughter. Someone shouted, "If you don't like it, leave." Another voice chimed in, "Rules are rules." Karen leaned forward over the podium, eyes glittering. "Sell the cabin," she said, her voice low but carrying. "Do the right thing. Otherwise," she tapped the stack of papers with one long fingernail, "we'll bury you in violations until you're forced to crawl out." A hush fell over the crowd, the threat hanging heavy in the air. Even her supporters shifted uncomfortably at the venom behind her words. I let the paper crumple in my fist. Every instinct screamed at me to fire back, to tear down her lies piece by piece. But I forced my face into calmness, masking the fury boiling beneath my skin. Without another word, I turned and walked out, the sound of laughter trailing me into the night. The cool air outside hit me like a slap. Stars burned coldly above the valley, far removed from the pettiness festering in that hall. I clenched my jaw, my fists aching. They thought they could intimidate me. They thought I'd fold. But as I stood there, staring at the dark line of the forest beyond the parking lot, something hardened inside me. Karen hadn't won a battle. She just declared war. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across my front porch. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint tang of paint from my neighbor's newly renovated fence. I was nursing a cup of coffee, still stewing over the latest HOA notice pinned to my door, a $200 fine for unauthorized garden decorations. The gnome in question, a chipped ceramic relic from my grandmother, had been in my flower bed for years without issue. Karen, the HOA president, had clearly made it her mission to nitpick every inch of my property since I dared to question her at the last meeting. The creak of footsteps on the gravel path snapped me out of my thoughts. Thomas, my neighbor from 2 houses down, approached with his hands stuffed in his pockets. His usual easygoing demeanor was gone, replaced by a twitchy energy. He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be lurking behind the neatly trimmed hedges before stepping onto my porch. He looked both nervous and relieved, like a man who just dodged a speeding car but knew another might be coming. "Hey," he said, voice low. "Got a minute?" I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Plenty. What's up?" He sat, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. His eyes darted to the street again before settling on me. "It's about Karen," he said, barely above a whisper. "I heard you got another fine." I snorted, holding up the notice. "Yeah, for my gnome. Apparently, it's a visual blight. You believe this crap?" Thomas didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. "Karen's been doing this for years. It's not just about the rules. She finds people, piles on the violations, until they can't pay. Then the HOA forecloses, flips the property, and she gets a cut." My blood ran cold. The coffee mug felt heavy in my hands, like it might slip through my fingers. I'd always thought Karen's obsession with rules was just petty power tripping, but this was calculated. Predatory. "You're saying she's running a scam?" "Out of the HOA. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight. "I've seen it happen. The Millers, 2 years ago, they got hit with fines every week. Lawn too long, mailbox too faded, shutters the wrong shade of beige. They fought it, but they couldn't keep up. Lost their house in 6 months. The HOA sold it to some developer, and Karen got a consulting fee for her trouble. Same thing with the Garcias before them." I set the mug down, my mind racing. The Millers had been good people, quiet, kept to themselves. I'd assumed they'd moved for work or family reasons. The thought that Karen had orchestrated their ruin made my stomach twist. "How do you know this?" I asked. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. "I overheard her talking to one of the board members at the community pool last summer. She didn't know I was there. They were laughing about it, like it was a game. Said they had a list of problem properties to target next. Your name came up." My fist clenched. "Me? Why?" "You challenged her at the meeting," he said. "You questioned the budget, asked where the maintenance fees were going. She doesn't like being questioned. Plus, your house. It's on a corner lot, big yard. Prime real estate. She's probably salivating over the commission." I leaned back in my chair, the pieces falling into place. The fines, the sudden inspections, the way Karen's eyes gleamed when she handed me violation notices. It wasn't just about control. It was about money. Greed. My home, my grandmother's home, filled with decades of memories, was just another payday to her. She picked the wrong target. I muttered, my voice low but steady. Anger burned through the shock, sharpening my thoughts. Thomas gave me a wary smile, like he wasn't sure whether to admire my defiance or pity my naivety. "I hope so," he said, "but be careful. She's got the board in her pocket, and they've got lawyers. They'll bury you in paperwork if you fight back." I nodded, but my mind was already elsewhere, turning over possibilities. Karen might have the HOA wrapped around her finger, but I wasn't the Millers or the Garcias. I wasn't going to roll over. If she wanted to fight, I'd give her one, but not on her terms. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, standing. "You didn't have to tell me." Thomas shrugged, rising to his feet. "Yeah, well, I'm tired of watching her run this place like her personal fiefdom. Just don't tell anyone I said anything, okay? I've got enough trouble keeping my azaleas up to code." I gave him a nod. My lips are sealed. As he walked away, disappearing into the lengthening shadows, I stood on the porch, staring at the offending gnome in my flower bed. It was chipped and weathered, sure, but it was mine, a small piece of my history. And I'd be damned if I let Karen take that, or anything else, from me. I turned and went inside, my coffee forgotten. It was time to dig into the HOA's records, talk to the neighbors, and figure out just how deep this went. Karen thought she was playing a game. Fine. I'd play too, but I was playing to win. The crisp morning air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as I hiked along the old trail behind my cabin. The path, worn smooth by decades of boots and bare feet, wound through the valley's heart, past streams that glittered like liquid silver and fishing spots where my grandfather once taught me to cast a line. This land had been a sanctuary for generations. Neighbors, kids, even tourists who wandered through our quiet mountain town. But now, as I crested a hill, I stopped dead in my tracks. A garish yellow, "No trespassing" sign glared back at me, nailed to a tree that had stood longer than I'd been alive. Below it, a chain locked the gate to the trailhead, its metal links glinting with menace in the morning light. I wasn't the only one who'd noticed. A handful of neighbors, old-timers like Mr. Grayson and young families like the Hendersons, had gathered nearby, muttering in disbelief. The trails had always been open, a shared treasure of the valley. Now, Karen's HOA was staking claim to them, one sign and chain at a time. I spotted her near the gate, hammering another sign into the soft earth with a zeal that bordered on obsession. Her crisp blazer and polished boots looked out of place against the wild backdrop of the forest. I strode toward her, my boots crunching on the gravel. "This isn't your land," I said, my voice steady but laced with anger. "These trails have been open for generations. You can't just lock them up." Karen didn't even pause, her hammer striking the signpost with a rhythmic clang. She straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and fixed me with a cold smile. "It's HOA land," she snapped. "Read the bylaws. The association controls all common areas, including these trails. You're just a guest here, like everyone else." Her words hit like a slap, but it was the smugness in her tone that made my blood boil. A guest? In the valley my family had called home for decades? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You're wrong, Karen. Very wrong." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed, and turned back to her work. "Take it up at the next meeting," she said dismissively. "Or don't. Either way, these signs stay." I watched her walk away, her heels clicking on the path like she owned it. But she didn't. And that was the thing. Karen didn't know the truth. When I bought the cabin 5 years ago, I hadn't just bought a rickety old house with creaky floors and a leaky roof. I'd bought the entire valley, every trail, every stream, every inch of dirt her precious signs were staked into. Even the road her own house sat on. The deed was clear, tucked away in a safe deposit box, its boundaries meticulously mapped out by a surveyor my grandfather had hired decades ago. The HOA might claim common areas, but their authority was a fiction built on sloppy paperwork and unchallenged assumptions. I hadn't realized the full extent of my ownership at first. It wasn't until last year, when I dug into the property records to settle a tax dispute, that I discovered the truth. My grandfather, a quiet man who loved this land more than anything, had purchased the valley outright in the 1960s, long before the HOA even existed. He'd never told a soul, not even my parents. The cabin was just a small piece of it, a humble front for a legacy that spanned miles. The HOA's bylaws, Karen's rules, her signs and chains, they were all built on a lie. I turned to the small crowd of neighbors, their faces a mix of frustration and resignation. Mr. Grayson, leaning on his cane, shook his head. "My kids used to fish in that stream," he said, pointing to the locked gate. "Now what? We're supposed to ask permission to walk our own land." "It's not right," Mrs. Henderson added, her toddler tugging at her hand. "This is our home, not some gated community." I nodded, my resolve hardening. "It's not our land," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And I'm going to prove it." Back at the cabin, I pulled out the deed and the surveyor's maps, spreading them across my kitchen table. The boundaries were unmistakable, drawn in precise lines that encompassed the trails, the streams, and even the access road that wound through the valley. Karen's house, a gaudy McMansion she'd built 3 years ago, sat squarely on a parcel I owned. She'd assumed the road was public, like everyone else. She'd never bothered to check. I spent the next few hours making calls. First, to a lawyer friend in town who specialized in property disputes. Then, to the county clerk's office to confirm the records were still on file. By the time I hung up, I had a plan. Karen thought she could bully the valley into submission with her signs and fines, but she'd overplayed her hand. I wasn't just going to fight her at the next HOA meeting. I was going to dismantle her entire operation. As dusk settled over the valley, I stepped onto my porch and looked out at the locked gates in the distance. The no trespassing signs glowed faintly in the fading light, a challenge I was ready to meet. Karen had no idea what was coming. This wasn't just about trails or streams anymore. It was about the truth, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. The community hall buzzed with tension, the air thick with murmured conversations and the faint creak of folding chairs. Every seat was filled, and a crowd spilled into the aisles. Neighbors, old-timers, and newcomers alike, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Word had spread about the HOA's latest move, and no one wanted to miss the showdown. Karen stood at the front, her posture rigid, her smile sharp and predatory, like a wolf circling its prey. She held a clipboard, her weapon of choice, and her voice cut through the room with practiced authority. "Order, please," she said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "Today, we vote on an urgent matter. The seizure of the cabin at 47 Valley Road for repeated noncompliance with HOA regulations." Her eyes flicked to me, seated in the front row, and her smile widened. "The owner has ignored fines, violated bylaws, and shown blatant disregard for our community standards. It's time to take action." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, swayed by Karen's polished delivery. Others, like Mr. Grayson and the Hendersons, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to me. They knew what was at stake. Not just my cabin, but the trails, the streams, the very soul of the valley. Karen's campaign of fines and foreclosures had gone unchallenged for too long, and now she was gunning for me, the one who dared to question her. I stood, my movements slow and deliberate, and stepped to the front of the room. The leather folder in my hands felt heavy, not with weight, but with the power it contained. Every eye followed me as I approached the long table where the HOA board sat, their faces a mix of smugness and boredom. Karen's gaze narrowed, but her smile held, confident she'd already won. "Before we vote," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I have something to share." I opened the folder and began laying out documents across the table. Yellowed deeds, surveyor's maps, and certified records. From the county clerk's office. The papers fanned out like a royal flush, each one a piece of undeniable truth. "These are the property records for this valley," I said, pointing to the maps. "Every trail, every stream, every access road. And this hall we're standing in? It's leased on my land." Gasps echoed through the room. Heads craned forward as neighbors leaned to get a better look. The maps were clear, their boundaries marked in bold ink. The entire valley, from the winding river to the forested hills, belonged to me. My grandfather's purchase in the 1960s had secured it all, long before the HOA was even a gleam in some developer's eye. The access road, the one Karen's McMansion depended on, mine. The trail she'd chained off with her no trespassing signs, mine. Even the plot under this very hall, rented to the HOA for a nominal fee my grandfather had never bothered to collect, mine. Karen's smile faltered, then crumbled entirely. Her clipboard slipped slightly in her hands, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "This is absurd," she stammered, her voice losing its polished edge. "These documents, they're not valid. You can't just. They're valid." I cut in, sliding a notarized copy of the deed toward her. "Certified by the county. I've had a lawyer review them, and the clerk's office confirmed them. You can check yourself, Karen, but you won't find a loophole. The HOA's claim to common areas is based on a clerical error from 1982, when the first board misfiled their boundaries. You've been operating on borrowed land, my land, for years." The room erupted in whispers, then shouts. Mr. Grayson stood, his cane thumping the floor. "You mean to tell me she's been locking up trails that don't even belong to her?" he demanded. Mrs. Henderson clutched her toddler closer, her face flushed with anger. "What about the fines? The foreclosures? Was that all lied to?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. The board members exchanged nervous glances, their earlier confidence evaporating. I pressed my advantage, my voice rising to fill the room. "The HOA has no authority here. Not over the trails, not over the streams, and certainly not over my cabin. Your fines, your rules, your seizures, they're done. From this moment, your power ends. This valley answers to me." The crowd roared, a mix of cheers and outraged questions. Karen's face turned ashen, her clipboard now clutched like a shield. "This "This isn't over," she sputtered, but her voice was drowned out by the growing clamor. The board members scrambled to gather their papers, one knocking over a water glass in their haste. I stepped back, the leather folders still in my hands, and met the eyes of my neighbors. Some looked stunned, others relieved, and a few, like Thomas, who'd tipped me off weeks ago, grinned with quiet triumph. The truth was out, and Karen's carefully built empire was collapsing under its own weight. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, I walked out of the hall, the cool night air hitting my face. The valley stretched before me, its hills and streams bathed in moonlight. It was mine, not just on paper, but in my bones, the way it had been for my grandfather. Karen could fight, but she'd already lost. The valley was awake now, and it wasn't hers to control anymore. The community hall was a powder keg, and my words had just struck the match. The air thrummed with raw energy as neighbors processed the bombshell I dropped. The maps and deeds spread across the table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their inked lines a silent testament to the truth. The valley, every trail, stream, and road belonged to me. Karen's empire of fines and foreclosures, built on years of unchecked power, was unraveling before her eyes. The crowd's murmurs grew into a roar, a chaotic symphony of shock, anger, and for some, a spark of hope. Karen stood frozen at the front of the room, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline. Her polished facade, those crisp blazers that practiced smile, had cracked, revealing the raw panic beneath. Her eyes darted from the documents to the faces of the board members, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier smugness replaced by a dawning realization that they'd hitched their wagon to a sinking ship. The crowd was turning, and I could feel it in the air, a seismic shift in allegiance. Neighbors who'd once laughed off my complaints about the HOA, dismissing me as the cranky cabin dweller, now stared with wide eyes. Some whispered to each other, pointing at the maps. A few, like old Mr. Grayson, clapped slowly, their applause cutting through the din like a drumbeat. I stood at the center of it all, the leather folder still warm in my hands. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the thrill of finally leveling the playing field. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, digging through dusty records, consulting my lawyer friend, cross-referencing every boundary line. Karen had underestimated me, thinking her fines and threats would wear me down like they had the Millers and the Garcias. But she'd miscalculated. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about the valley, the people, and the legacy my grandfather had left me to protect. A board member, a wiry man named Harold with a perpetually sweaty brow, cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he spoke. What exactly does this mean?" he asked, glancing nervously at Karen, then back at me. "These documents, if they're real, what happens to the HOA?" The room quieted, all eyes on me. I stepped forward, placing a hand on the table, my fingers brushing the edge of the surveyor's map. "It means your rules don't apply to me," I said, my voice steady and clear. "The HOA's authority over this valley, over the trails, the streams, the roads, was based on a lie. A clerical error from 1982 that you never bothered to verify. This land is mine, and I'm done letting you pretend otherwise. No more fines, no more foreclosures, no more extortion. Anyone who wants fair treatment in this valley will have it, starting now." The crowd erupted. Cheers mixed with shouts of disbelief, and a few angry voices rose above the rest, directed at Karen and the board. Mrs. Henderson, clutching her toddler, stood up, her face flushed. "You mean we've been paying thousands in fees for nothing?" she demanded. "My husband worked overtime to cover your fines for our fence last year. You said it was for community upkeep, but where's that money gone?" Mr. Grayson thumped his cane, his voice raspy but fierce. "The Millers lost their home because of you people. You hounded them out, and now you're saying it was all on stolen land?" Karen's face was a mask of barely contained fury, her knuckles white around her clipboard. She took a step forward, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You can't do this," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "You think you can just waltz in here with some old papers and dismantle everything we've built? The HOA has legal standing, contracts, bylaws. Actually, I interrupted, tapping the deed with a finger. I already did. I slid a copy of the notarized deed toward her, its official seal glinting in the light. This isn't a negotiation, Karen. The county records are clear. The surveyor's maps are clear. Your house, your precious cul-de-sac, it's all on my land. The HOA's been leasing this hall from me, or rather from my grandfather's estate, for decades. You didn't even know, did you? You thought you were untouchable. The room fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, her composure unraveling like a cheap sweater. The board members exchanged frantic glances, their whispers growing urgent. Harold mopped his brow with a handkerchief, muttering something about legal counsel. Another board member, a woman named Diane who'd always trailed Karen like a loyal shadow, stood up, her chair scraping loudly. "This is outrageous," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "We need to verify these documents. We can't just take his word." "You're welcome to verify them," I said, cutting her off. "The county clerk's office is open tomorrow, but I've already done the legwork. The lawyer I consulted is ready to file an injunction against the HOA's operations in this valley. Every fine, every lien, every foreclosure you've issued since you started this scam, it's all voidable. And I intend to make sure it's voided." The crowd roared again, louder this time. Thomas, my neighbor who'd tipped me off about Karen's schemes, stood up, his usually timid demeanor replaced by a quiet resolve. "I'm with him," he said, pointing at me. "I've got records of every fine you slapped on me for my azaleas, my mailbox, my damn porch light. I want my money back." Others joined in, their voices overlapping. "What about my shed permit?" one shouted. "You charged me $500 for a variance," another yelled. The hall was a sea of raised hands and indignant faces, neighbors who'd been silenced by fear or resignation now, finding their courage. Karen's reign had relied on their compliance, but that compliance was crumbling. Karen's face twisted, her eyes darting to the exits as if she might bolt. "This is a coup," she shouted, slamming her clipboard on the table. "You're trying to destroy our community. The HOA keeps this valley civilized. Without us, it'd be chaos." "Civilized?" I shot back, stepping closer. "You call bankrupting families civilized? You call chaining off trails that kids have played on for generations civilized? You've been fleecing people for years, Karen, and pocketing the profits while you're at it. That ends tonight." The crowd surged forward, their voices a tidal wave. Some clapped, others shouted questions about refunds, about the trails, about what came next. Karen tried to speak, but her words were drowned out. The board members were scrambling now, gathering their papers and whispering furiously. One, a man I barely recognized, slipped out the side door, his phone already pressed to his ear. I raised a hand, and the room quieted just enough for me to be heard. "I'm not here to lord this over anyone," I said. "This valley belongs to all of us in spirit, always has. My grandfather wanted it to be a place where people could live free, not under someone's thumb. I'm opening the trails and streams again, effective immediately. No more fines, no more foreclosures. If you've been hit with unfair penalties, come talk to me. We'll sort it out, together." The applause was deafening, a wave of sound that shook the rafters. Mr. Grayson hobbled over, his eyes shining. "Your granddad would be proud," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Henderson hugged her toddler, tears streaking her face as she mouthed a quiet thank you. Even the skeptics, the ones who'd sided with Karen out of habit or fear, looked shaken, their loyalties shifting in real time. Karen, meanwhile, was unraveling. She grabbed her clipboard and stormed toward the door, shoving past neighbors who no longer stepped aside for her. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You'll hear from my lawyer." I watched her go, the deed still in my hand. "Good luck with that," I said under my breath. My lawyer had already warned me she'd try to fight, drag it out in court, bury me in legal fees. But I was ready. The truth was on my side, and the valley was waking up. As the crowd dispersed, neighbors lingered, some shaking my hand, others asking questions about the land and what it meant for them. Thomas hung back, a grin on his face. "You really did it," he said. "You took her down. Not yet, I said, glancing at the maps on the table. But this is a start. Outside, the night was cool and clear, the stars sharp against the black sky. The valley stretched out before the hall, its hills and streams alive with possibility. For the first time in years, it felt like mine again, not just on paper, but in the way that mattered. The power had shifted, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. The days following the HOA meeting were a whirlwind, the valley alive with a restless energy it hadn't seen in years. Word of my revelation spread like wildfire, carried from porch to porch, whispered over fences, and debated in the local diner where the coffee was as strong as the gossip. The maps and deeds I'd laid out in the community hall had shattered the illusion of Karen's authority, and the cracks in her carefully constructed empire were growing wider by the hour. Neighbors who'd once bowed to her clipboard now exchanged knowing glances, their fear replaced by a quiet, simmering defiance. The valley was waking up, and Karen was scrambling to hold onto the reins. She didn't go quietly. Desperation drove her, a cornered animal lashing out with every tool at her disposal. The morning after the meeting, I woke to find a county inspector parked outside my cabin, clipboard in hand, scribbling notes about my property line. Karen stood nearby, her arms crossed, a smug glint in her eye as she pointed out supposed violations. A fence post slightly askew, a tree branch overhanging the road. "You may own the land," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "but you still have to follow county codes." The inspector, a tired-looking man named Carl who'd clearly dealt with Karen before, barely glanced at her. He took one look at my deed, cross-referenced it with his tablet, and shook his head. "Ma'am, this property's boundaries are clear. He's within his rights." He tipped his hat to me and drove off, leaving Karen fuming on a gravel path. It was the first of many defeats. She didn't stop there. Karen called in every favor she had, pulling strings with anyone who'd listen. She hired a lawyer from the city, a slick type in an expensive suit who showed up with a briefcase full of motions and a swagger that didn't match the facts. He filed a lawsuit against me, claiming the HOA's bylaws superseded my deed, that the community interest gave them rights to the valley's common areas. But my lawyer, a sharp woman named Ellen who'd grown up in the valley and knew its history, was ready. She presented the county records, the surveyor's maps, and a stack of correspondence proving the HOA had been operating on a clerical error for decades. The judge, unimpressed by Karen's lawyer's bluster, dismissed the case in under an hour. "The deed is ironclad," he said, his gavel a punctuation mark on Karen's fading power. The losses piled up, each one chipping away at her armor. She tried the county planning office, arguing that my ownership disrupted their zoning plans. They sent her away with a copy of the same records I'd shown. She appealed to the state, claiming eminent domain for the access roads. The state's response was a polite letter stating that private property rights took precedence. Every door she knocked on slammed shut, each authority echoing the same truth: the valley was mine. But the real blow came from within. Karen's own board, the loyal lieutenants who'd backed her every fine and foreclosure, began to turn. Harold, the sweaty-browed board member, was the first to crack. At a hastily called emergency meeting, he stood up, his voice shaking but resolute. "I didn't sign up for this," he said, addressing a room of angry neighbors. Karen told us the HOA owned the land. She said the fines were legal, that it was all for the community. I trusted her. We all did. He glanced at her, then away, as if ashamed to meet her eyes. "I'm stepping down." Diane, Karen's shadow, followed suit 2 days later, citing personal reasons in a curt email to the board. The truth was clear. They'd seen the writing on the wall. The neighbors, once cowed into silence, were withdrawing their support en masse. At the diner, over backyard fences, in group chats that buzzed late into the night, rumors spread like sparks in dry grass. Stories of Karen's schemes, how she'd targeted vulnerable families, how she'd pocketed consulting fees from property flips, how she'd manipulated the bylaws to tighten her grip, circulated with growing outrage. The Millers' foreclosure, once a hushed tragedy, became a rallying cry. People began digging through their own records, tallying up years of fines for minor infractions. A mailbox an inch too tall, a shrub not pruned code. The numbers were staggering. Thomas, my whistleblower neighbor, became an unlikely leader in the rebellion. He organized a meeting at his house, where dozens crowded into his living room, sharing stories and comparing notes. "She fined me $300 for a birdhouse," one woman said, holding up a crumpled notice. Said it was unapproved exterior decor. "I paid because I didn't want trouble." Another neighbor, a retired mechanic, admitted he'd nearly lost his home over a lien for unpaid fines. The room pulsed with anger, but also with purpose. They weren't just fighting for refunds. They were fighting for their homes, their freedom, their valley. Karen's final stand came a week later, outside her own house. I'd driven by to check on the access road, which I'd reopened to the public after removing her chains and signs. She stood on her manicured lawn, her McMansion looming behind her, its oversized windows reflecting the setting sun. A small crowd had gathered, neighbors, former board members, even a local reporter who'd caught wind of the story. Karen's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a megaphone, her last attempt to reclaim control. "This is my home," she shouted, her voice shrill and cracking. "You can't take it from me. I built this community. I made it what it is." I stepped out of my truck, the deed in my hand, and walked toward her. The crowd parted, their eyes on me. "You built nothing," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You cheated people. You lied to them. You chained off land that was never yours. And that house you're standing in front of, it's on my property. The road you drive on, Mine. You've been a guest here, Karen, and you've overstayed your welcome." The crowd murmured, some cheering, others nodding solemnly. Karen's megaphone slipped from her hands, hitting the grass with a dull thud. She stared at me, then at the neighbors, searching for a single ally, and finding none. The reporters scribbled furiously, her pen a quiet witness to Karen's downfall. In the end, Karen stood alone, a solitary figure in front of the house she no longer controlled. Her reign was over, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a slow, inevitable collapse. The neighbors began to disperse, their voices lighter, their steps surer. Thomas clapped me on the shoulder as he passed, a grin on his face. "You did it," he said. "You really did it." I looked out over the valley, its hills bathed in the golden glow of dusk. The streams were open again, the trails free for kids to explore, for families to fish and wander. The valley was alive, breathing, no longer suffocated by Karen's rules. I didn't know what came next: lawsuits, negotiations, maybe even rebuilding the HOA into something fair. But for now, it was enough. The truth had won, and the valley was ours again. The valley exhaled. After months of tension, of locked gates and whispered fears, it was as if the land itself could finally breathe again. The trails, once chained shut by Karen's no trespassing signs, were open, their paths worn anew by the footsteps of neighbors reclaiming their freedom. Streams sparkled under the sun, no longer off limits, their banks alive with kids casting fishing lines and families picnicking in the shade. The air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, untainted by the weight of HOA notices or the threat of fines. The valley was becoming what my grandfather had always intended, a place of peace, a sanctuary where people could live without someone's clipboard hovering over their shoulder. Rebuilding trust, though, was a slower process. Karen's reign had left scars, neighbors who'd lost homes, others who'd paid thousands in fines for trivial violations, and a lingering suspicion that had pitted friend against friend. The community hall, once a stage for her power plays, became a gathering place for something new. I started hosting meetings there, not as an HOA president or a landlord lording over the valley, but as a neighbor with a stake in its future. The deed gave me ownership, but I wanted more than that. I wanted the valley to feel like home again for everyone. The first meeting was awkward, the room half full, the air thick with uncertainty. Mr. Grayson sat in the front row, his cane propped against his knee, his weathered face skeptical but curious. Mrs. Henderson was there too, her toddler asleep in her lap, her eyes searching mine for answers. Thomas, ever the optimist, stood by the door, greeting people as they trickled in. I laid out the maps and deeds again, not as a weapon this time, but as a promise. "This land is mine," I said, my voice steady, "but it's yours too in spirit. My grandfather bought this valley to keep it free, not to control it. I want to honor that." I outlined my plan. No more fines, no more foreclosures. The trails and streams were open to all, no permission needed. The access roads, including the one running past Karen's former McMansion, were public again, maintained by a voluntary fund I'd seed with my own money until we could sort out a fair system. For those who've been hit with unfair fines, I promised restitution, working with my lawyer, Ellen, to audit the HOA's records and refund what had been extorted. The room listened in near silence, the weight of years of mistrust hanging heavy. It wasn't all smooth. Some, like Harold, the former board member, were hesitant, their loyalty to the old system lingering like a bad habit. "What's to stop you from becoming another Karen?" he asked, his brow sweaty as always. It was a fair question, one I'd anticipated. "I'm not here to rule," I said. "I'm here to fix what's broken. If you want a new HOA, we can build one, together. Transparent, accountable, no secret deals or consulting fees. But it's up to you. This valley doesn't need a dictator." Slowly, the tide turned. Neighbors started showing up at my cabin, not with complaints, but with ideas. Mrs. Henderson suggested a community garden on a plot near the stream, a place where kids could learn to plant and grow. Mr. Grayson, gruff as ever, offered to teach fishing workshops, passing on tricks he'd learned from his own father. Thomas, with his knack for organization, started a newsletter to keep everyone informed. No bylaws or threats, just updates on trail cleanups and potlucks. The valley began to knit itself back together, one small act at a time. As for Karen, her downfall was complete within months. After her failed lawsuit and the county's repeated rejections, she tried one last desperate gambit, a public campaign to paint me as a greedy landowner seizing control. She posted flyers around town, sent emails to the local paper, even tried rallying support on social media. But the valley had turned against her. The rumors she'd once fueled about her schemes, her lies, her profiteering, had taken root, and no one was buying her story anymore. The reporter who'd witnessed her meltdown outside her house published a scathing article, complete with quotes from neighbors and a photo of my deed. The headline read, "HOA President's Power Grab Built on Stolen Land." Humiliated and powerless, Karen packed up and left. Her McMansion, that gaudy monument to her ego, went up for sale, but no one bid. Not when the fine print disclosed that the land and access road belonged to me. She moved to a condo in the city, her name a cautionary tale whispered in the valley's diners and bars. Some said she was still fighting, filing appeals from afar, but they were like the last gasps of a dying storm. She was gone, and the valley was better for it. I spent my evenings on the porch of my cabin, the same chipped ceramic gnome still guarding my flower bed. The sun would dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and I'd sip my coffee, watching the valley come alive. Kids biked down the reopened roads, their laughter echoing. Neighbors waved as they passed, some stopping to chat about the weather or the latest community project. The streams burbled, the trails wound through the hills, and the air felt lighter, as if the land itself was relieved. Sometimes, I'd think back to Karen's smug smile, her certainty that she could control me with her fines and signs. She'd had no idea, not of the deed, not of the valley's history, not of the fire she'd ignited by pushing too far. She thought she could bully me into submission, that I'd buckle like the others. But she didn't know I owned everything she stood on, not just the land, but the truth, the will to fight, the legacy my grandfather had left me. As dusk settled, I'd smile, the warmth of it spreading through me. The valley was mine, not in a possessive way, but in the way a steward claims a duty. It was mine to protect, to share, to nurture. And as the stars began to prick the sky, I'd lean back in my chair, the weight of the fight behind me, and let the peace of the valley wash over me. This was home. This was ours. And no one, not Karen, not anyone, would take it away again.